This media series has been filled with experts all week long. Now our collective job is to set you on the road to becoming experts of your own, expert news consumers. This isn't a startling idea, of course. It's just that it's rarely been tried before with the commodity we call news. It's common enough for a person who goes out to buy a car to know enough about how the car functions and about driving so that he can pick and choose with skill. And we label the person who doesn't do his homework before going to make such a purchase as financially dotty. Well, news is also a commodity, only the consequences can be far more serious if you fail to use it wisely. People who misunderstand the news process often enough and long enough can wake up one day to find themselves no longer living in a functioning democracy. First of all, a bit of background. Why, in more specific terms, is news worth bothering about?
Well, I think maybe it starts with this. Information can be power. We tailor our behavior according to information, according to news in part. We use facts and suppositions and all the other ingredients of news to shape our lives. A piece of news is responsible for most of us being Americans, except for any Native American Indians among us. The piece of news heard by our ancestors that there was a fresh land to go to. News plays its part in where we live today and what we work at. This is why I think information is power. It fuels some of our decision making. If you have any doubts that information can be power, I ask you what the Watergate affair is all about. The great issues there boil down to who has information about what. Another reason why we bother with judging the quality of news, the media which bring it are the extension of the citizen in our particular form of society. This representative democracy has grown beyond the town meeting, the purest form of democracy, where each qualified adult cast a direct vote in community policy. That's ideal, but we've outgrown it. Now the citizen presumably retains his voice in government through the officials he elects, and he should get straight information about them as a way of measuring their performance. So the private citizen himself, even were he a Ralph Nader, can't check personally on every single office of government, and probably wouldn't want to. Can't think of anyone with the stamina or stomach to go about that. Comprehensive news gathering of that sort already was getting beyond the capabilities of a lone citizen some 300 years ago. Look back at Samuel Pepys, that exacting diarist of London life in the 17th century, the man who said, "and so to bed," every night in his diary. Well, Mr. Pepys worked as a bureaucrat in the Admiralty. With only a stale official gazette of foreign happenings to go by, he spent most of his day searching out news. He nosed into Westminster Hall, the coffee houses, the Royal Exchange, and of course the taverns. After which, Pepys still had to try to separate fact from rumor. Well, in a society as big as our own, we can't follow his example by trying to do our own reporting. Today, journalists must function as the news gatherers. You see, freedom of the press is a rather misleading phrase. The news media have no claim to special privilege except as an extension of the citizen, to go where he cannot, summarize the important, explain the complex, uncover the dubious, and get the news to the consumer, to you. The newsman in these tasks acts as the citizen's proxy, the necessary agent in doing the job of collecting the news. The news consumer too often forgets that freedom of the press actually amounts to freedom of the people to have information searched out for them by the press. Next on this very short list of reasons for taking care with the news comes you yourself, your habits as a news consumer. In the workroom behind your forehead, you dabble as editor and rewrite man. News comes apart easily inside your head. As a writer and reporter, I sometimes think it absolutely falls apart in there. It comes apart so easily. But lamentably, few of us have perfect memories, so our minds mostly remember highlights. No matter how carefully and fairly a reporter tells a complex story, the consumer a few minutes later may recall only big, bold outlines of the news item, and perhaps not too accurate outlines at that. And you work on the news in other ways. You would rather hear about progress than failure. But much of the day-by-day news will be a mockery for a mind set on progress. So much of the news has to do with the products of our heads, not our hands. Legislation, war, opinion, debate, prejudice. These staples of the news seldom are comfortable for the consumer, and you don't like them much, and you tend to take it out on the media. Also, the news consumer peeks out at the news from inside a security blanket wrapped around the brain. It's called stereotypes. In news coverage of race relations, for instance, you may see the center stage figures as demons or as heroes. If the news media present information to the contrary, you write it off as bias. The media's bias, and not your own. The consumer, faithful to his stereotypes, and most of us are to some degree or another, mentally rewrites the reporter's version of the facts. Well, that's a very brief set of reasons why you should bother to be a knowledgeable news consumer. Now take a look at the nature of news as you deal with it.
News is a commodity, a saleable and frequently discussed commodity, yet it's elusive. You certainly ought to feel that you can read a story, throw it aside in disgust, and say, that doesn't belong in the newspaper, it isn't news. But when you say that, you ought to know why you're doing it. Traditionally, journalism students have been taught that a news story contains certain values, and if you look closely at a news story, you'll be able to find one or more of these values in it. One standard list includes timeliness. Did the event happen recently, or was it discovered recently? Proximity, a category that attempts to judge how close a story comes to its audience. It may be geographically near the mayor of your town indicted for corruption, or it may be close in the sense that the Vietnam War was close. A place halfway around the world, but where millions of us had friends or relatives with their lives on the line. Prominence. How well known are the people involved? If you get your finger caught in a car door, it probably isn't news except to you, your family, and if that finger helps you earn a living, your boss. If President Nixon smashes his finger, it's news, simply because he's President of the United States. Human interest, and here's the flip side of that last category. Sometimes a story with few other qualities will become news because of something unusual that happens to somebody ordinary. When I was in college, I surveyed photo editors around the country, asking them what they thought the best possible human interest picture would be. One of them, an editor in Jersey City, New Jersey, which has long been a hotbed of corruption, didn't answer along that line at all. His choice was a small boy and a dog, adrift in a rowboat, in the middle of a flood, in the center of Jersey City. That's human interest. Consequence or significance. How important is the story to the reader? If war and peace hang in the balance, presumably everyone is vitally involved and the story has great significance. Some stories have a lot of significance for just part of the population, but little for others. Some stories, human interest stories most notably, have little consequence at all. We were interested when we came home last May after spending 8 months in Britain to find a whole new category of significant news. Gasoline shortages, inflation, power cutbacks, food prices on the express elevator. And the newspapers today, both in Denver and here, were kind enough to give us some good examples of this. The main headline in the Denver Post, cost of living surges, food jump highest since 1933. Des Moines Tribune, fairly similar headline, and the biggest one again, price rise at 26-year high. Important news these days, and it wasn't at all when we left the country last October. All right, We have then timeliness, proximity, prominence, human interest, consequence. And some newsmen would add conflict to the list. Some would use different terms. Others might come up with significantly different lists. Indeed, some news people and critics have been saying that we've been defining news wrongly. It's too negative. And some broadcasters have been advertising theirs as good news stations recently and trying to emphasize stories that are positive in outlook. Most news personnel, though, are still unconvinced. David Brinkley of NBC declares, "Placidity is not news. If an airplane departs on time and arrives on time, it isn't news. If it crashes, regrettably it is." And Walter Cronkite of CBS, who's quite a different style of newsman, seems to agree about this. Responding to a college co-ed who wanted news coverage of the majority of students who quietly went to class a couple of years ago, while others marched and demonstrated, he said, "It's a little bit like having to report all the cats that aren't lost that day."
Whatever the form of news, the consumer must continually ask a set of questions about the news. The authority of a story rests on these questions. Who says so, and how does he know? Carol and I spent quite a bit of time sitting around airports today reading newspapers as we tried to get here. The people in Denver today had quite a choice of versions about the death of the Chilean President Allende. I noticed that in the Rocky Mountain News, you can have the story out of Mexico City by one wire service that probably he was submachine gunned to death by the people who took over the country. Meanwhile, the Denver Post, very same day, has a story from another wire service that Allende committed suicide. You have to look at these stories, see what the sources are. They're pretty close to the respective sides in either case. And my inclination is to say neither is very conclusive at this point. Anyway, these are the sorts of questions you must ask. Who says so, and how does he know? You ask these first of the newsman. The news he's presenting should have a verifiable source, plainly identified by name and background, usually a person being quoted. But what seems a simple matter of naming sources is one of the sharp dilemmas of journalism. On the one hand, a basic journalistic rule is that every news story must make clear the source the information came from. This is the authority or attribution for a story. If a report doesn't contain the attributed comments of the persons involved, you have every right to be skeptical of the newsman. On the other hand, when no one in authority will comment or won't permit his name to be attached to a comment, the newsman must turn to other methods. And here, sources without names inevitably come into the news process. Now, Watergate has towered above all other recent stories, and it is clear that unnamed sources have been absolutely necessary in breaking this colossal story. I trust Barry Sussman talked about this at some length the other night, about finding the sources, even though most of them could not have their names used. Other times, however, sources in a position to know can be more suspect. They might, for instance, be sending out a trial balloon, testing the public mood without taking any responsibility for their actions. President-elect John F. Kennedy did this when he wanted to name Robert Kennedy, his brother, as Attorney General. He wasn't sure whether shrieks of nepotism would be heard. To find out, he leaked the story to the New York Times without attribution and sat back to assess the reaction. Had the public outcry been nasty, Kennedy could have decided against naming his brother to the cabinet without having to reverse himself publicly. The Kennedy trial balloon floated without much comment, and about a month after the story first appeared in the news, Robert Kennedy was duly nominated as Attorney General. In the past week or so, the Nixon White House has been floating a trial balloon at us, and Melvin Laird thinking out loud about possible higher taxes. Both CBS and NBC newsmen on the network shows we saw properly labeled the story as an obvious trial balloon. George Shultz, among other people, was busy trying to shoot it down, I gather. But you're not always going to get such obvious help of the newsmen labeling stories as trial balloons. This one just had big letters all over it. A reporter learns one lesson early. The more critical and vital the story, the more likely is the no-comment response or downright deception. We will keep on getting a lot of our news from sources which newsmen can't attach a name to. It's not great, but it has to be done sometimes. The consumer can try some working rules, however, to try gauge whether the reporter seems honest in his game of sources. First, you have the right to expect a clear source for every statement in every news story, except where a reporter witnesses the event himself and except for statements of very common knowledge. Second, if a source was queried and would not comment, the story should say so. It'll help the consumer to know what effort was made to dig out information. You'll know who the newsman has been talking to or trying to talk to. Third, if the source won't talk for the record, but the story is vital to the public's right to know, the reporter's job is to investigate anyway and present his evidence by nameless sources if necessary. Finally, if the reporter presents no source and no credible evidence, the story moves from the category of news to speculation, and the reporter's reputation and that of his news organization is squarely on the line. While having taken some care with the newsman, next you must do the same with the news source. If a voice on the tape recorder tells you the Earth is a trapezoid, you receive both accuracy and inaccuracy. The voice is transmitted faithfully, but what the voice says is false. That's the fix you're in whenever sham lodges itself in news stories, despite the most scrupulous efforts by newsmen to be accurate. So you have to go beyond the media's faithful transmission of a quote and consider whether the source may be feeding sham into the media. Be aware of whom you are listening to and why. No matter what the source, you want to listen skeptically. There's uncertain territory, for instance, for the news consumer when listening to the experts who show up in the news, as they do so much. Scientists, as an example. Back in Samuel Pepys' time, which we looked at briefly a bit ago, nearly every Englishman with any scientific skills at all could be found at a meeting of the Royal Society. The Society's journal was the country's sole regular report of scientific knowledge. Very easy to check on science in those days, only one real place to do it. Well, today, the news consumer hardly needs to be told that scientists abound and that their works and comments flood around us from many news outlets. A scientist speaking as an expert in his field probably won't have credentials as widely known as, say, a political leader's. The consequences of what he says may be hard to grasp, but the consumer still can be a skeptic. For one thing, he can weigh the expert's words to see whether what is said is a prediction or a definite result. For example, a prediction by a scientist that genes, the basic chemical units of heredity, can someday be analyzed is one thing. Actual isolation of a gene from the complex chain of life, as was achieved at Harvard Medical School in 1969, is something very different. The difference almost between a fellow talking about taking a step for mankind on the moon and actually doing it. Reminding yourself that a prediction is not a reality until after it happens ought to be applied to other experts as well. The poll takers, for example. Opinion polling came into our public life somewhat the way the forward pass came into football. It's followed just about as avidly in this country. Instead of grinding along step by step to see what actually develops, we use this fast shortcut. But as some coaches point out, I don't know what school the Iowa State coach would be in on this, any of three things can happen when you put the ball in the air, and two of them, an incomplete pass and an interception, are bad. Well, when a polling crew asks its questions of the sample segment of our population, three things can happen, and two of them aren't very good for accurate prediction. The interviewee will tell the truth. The interviewee will not tell the truth. The interviewee will say he is undecided. 2 chances out of 3 against accuracy. The news consumer then should take poll results with extreme caution. At the very minimum, you should judge them by how many persons were polled, when, and precisely what the wording of the questions was. Then, what of the source who offers opinion because his big name gives him entry to the media? This is the celebrity. A prime case happened in January of 1964. when astronaut John Glenn announced he was running for the Democratic nomination for a U.S. Senate seat from Ohio. Colonel Glenn said, "I feel that it provides the best opportunity to make use of the experience I have gained in 22 years of government service." Well, a question forms automatically in the mind of the careful news consumer. What did John Glenn do in those 22 years of government service? The answer, he was a Marine flyer and the first American astronaut to orbit the Earth. Neither accomplishment certified any special talent for the American process of government. But they didn't disqualify Colonel Glenn either. Every public official is an amateur back at the point where he enters politics. So the next question, what does John Glenn say about public issues important to the campaign? The answer, nothing. Nothing at all. Colonel Glenn explained that because he still was in the Marine Corps, he couldn't enter into any political discussion until his discharge, 6 weeks away. Well, Colonel Glenn eventually withdrew from the Senate race because of an injury suffered when he slipped in the bathtub. But his luck, rather than his celebrityhood, let him down. Yet when Glenn was listened to skeptically, he had entered the Senate race with little to offer except celebrityhood. Well, he is not the first and certainly not the last of celebrities to come into the news in this way. Learning to look skeptically at big names may tell us, then, whether or not the celebrity is talking about something he knows about, whether or not he can back up his remarks with something besides an inflated name. An approximate guide for judging both the news people and their news sources comes down to this, a sort of quick oversimplification. Any comment should be looked over for its basis. Who says so? How do they know? And everyone's credentials are open to suspicion. You can ask yourself about both newsman and news source. What evidence does he offer to prove what he says? And then you keep an eye on his record.
Once you've determined the source of a news story and decided that he has the background to talk about the subject at hand, you have another problem to deal with. Is he telling the truth? The phrase credibility gap is a fairly new one, coined during Lyndon Johnson's presidency to indicate a growing reluctance on the part of citizens to believe their leaders. The phenomenon itself isn't new. George Washington was defamed in the press in ways that we wouldn't dream of doing today. But the credibility problem has grown to epidemic proportions in the last decade. Let's face it, what we're dealing with here in the phrase credibility gap is really a euphemism. More bluntly put, it's how do we know who's lying and when? In simpler days, we believed the President of the United States when he spoke. Most of us did, anyway. If you study the history of the presidency, you'll be well aware that presidents didn't tell the truth in all cases, but most people thought they did. Then along came the 50s and a particularly popular and credible president, Dwight Eisenhower, who was almost faultless until he was caught in one of the biggest lies of all. President Eisenhower assured us that no spy planes were flying over Russia, that he had given personal orders forbidding such flights. And what happened? You'll recall that the Russians not only came up with a U-2 aircraft, but with its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, as well. That produced a full-blown international incident and wrecked a summit conference. Perhaps that was the end of public naivete about presidential pronouncements. People know by now that presidents do not always tell the truth, and so it isn't possible for our current president to say, "I did not know about Watergate," and have the majority of people believe him, even though a very hefty majority of voters re-elected him not long ago. Although we haven't time tonight to dig into the record of presidents, there's a new book that'll do the job for you. It's called The Politics of Lying, and its author is David Wise, an experienced political writer whose own credibility is very good indeed. Our immediate problem is, when can you believe a president or any other public official? For that matter, when can you believe a businessman or woman? If Eisenhower's U-2 lie was the end of innocence about governmental statements, perhaps it was the sight of the president of General Motors apologizing publicly to Ralph Nader for GM spying into his private life after previous denials that ended our innocence about the pronouncements of corporate America. The President of the United States is not necessarily telling the truth all the time just because he's president. Maybe we think he should, but that's not what the record reveals. Similarly, a statement is not necessarily true just because it's on General Motors' letterhead. A healthy skepticism on the part of the news consumer is one of his most valuable assets. And he can help sharpen that skepticism by framing questions to fit particular stories. Is the current petroleum shortage unrelated to the oil company's wish for the Alaska pipeline? Is Senator Henry Jackson carrying on 4 simultaneous investigations because his concern for the country has escalated, or because he wants to be president? In addition, if a news story is important to you, you'll want to see whether more than unsupported statements are presented. Is there evidence? Are there corresponding statements from other sources? Is the internal evidence consistent? Finally, what is the news source selling? Toothpaste? Eternal bliss? Perfume? Himself? The British and French governments have been taking a lot of flack within their countries about their own version of the SST, the Concorde. You may have noticed in last night's news or today's paper that one of their 2 prototype models has just made its first visit to the United States, down in Texas. In Britain, the Sunday Observer's air correspondent, Andrew Wilson, detailed week after week last winter and spring the economic and environmental problems with the plane. Then he cited all the airlines which would abandon their options to buy, and in the proper order. The government repeatedly denied Wilson's stories and repeatedly was proved wrong. But it was trying, of course, to save the prestige, the money, the jobs involved, the total project. The Concorde originally had 74 options. Significantly, it picked up no more when our SST was killed by Congress. Most of the 74 have been dropped, and at the point where we left Britain in the spring, only 9 options had been converted into firm orders. All of them captive orders from the maker's own state airlines, Air France and BOAC. Now, the track record on this issue is clear. If you're in Britain and you want the truth about the SST, read the Observer. Don't mess with government spokesmen. Unlike a court of law where previous convictions are not supposed to be held against the defendant, one of the news consumer's strongest pieces of evidence is the previous record of the source and also of the reporter. Make a habit of reading bylines in your local newspapers and noting who reports which story on television. Some reporters are better than others and more consistent than others in getting at the truth. Now let's consider some of the tricks of language and phrasing. Consciously or subconsciously, the way a journalist puts words together may bias a report. Besides looking for bias, you should examine statements to see what they exclude. Prepared statements especially are fair game for fine-tooth combing. A lot of this has been done during the Watergate investigation, but I hope the issue doesn't sound partisan because it's not. President Lyndon Johnson was an ace at playing word games with the public by way of the newsmen. President Johnson particularly disliked news of his political appointments to leak out before he was just good and ready to announce them himself. In March of 1967, he was asked about a report that he was searching for a successor to Henry Cabot Lodge, who was then U.S. Ambassador to South Vietnam. The president responded, "No, there is no truth that I am looking for a successor." Less than a week later, Ellsworth Bunker was named to replace Lodge, and Press Secretary George Christian maintained that the president's original remark had been absolutely accurate. He had not been searching for a successor to Lodge because he had already found one. Examples of word wizardry of this kind are easy to find, and we could spend the rest of the evening on them. Instead, we'll settle for recommending that book by Hayakawa, Language and Thought in Action, and George Orwell's novel, 1984, in which a totalitarian state is built on the manipulation of language. Most of you no doubt have read it, but it's worth rereading. you'll remember that the slogans of the insidiously repressive government which Orwell created were, "Ignorance is strength, freedom is slavery, war is peace." Incredible? Yes. But stop a while and listen to the language analysts who remind us that in our own land and in our own time, we have heard Department of Defense spokesmen, not War Department, mind you, that name was changed after World War II, but Department of Defense spokesmen try to mesmerize us with words. In the language of the Vietnam involvement, another term that sounds more pleasing than war, invasions became incursions. Bombings became protective reactions. And the destruction of whole villages, and sometimes their inhabitants, was, we were told, pacification. We were further assured that troops had to destroy these villages to save them. That, when you stop to think of it, is every bit the equal of the fantastic sloganeering of Orwell's 1984. In the 1960s and 1970s, war is pacification, and freedom is death.
Somewhere in all of us, the suspicion nags as we go through the news. We are not being told everything. Well, the suspicion is right, but often for the wrong reason. Conspiracy usually comes to mind. The news consumer mutters to himself that of course they won't tell that story. It would catch the mayor's niece in scandal, or it'd make the biggest department store owner mad, or countless other slightly sinister reasons. Actually, discovering a conspiracy of newsmen is about as unlikely as finding a town full of news consumers who agree on every issue. It's hard to believe that everybody can be in such close cahoots, nobody ever getting mad or talkative or drunk and spilling the beans, yet this is what news enterprises endlessly are accused of. News stories not told or told ineptly or half-heartedly probably are not impeded by deliberate plotting, but by frames of mind which inhibit their telling. News people are citizens too. Every so often they can be found pledging allegiance on the side of the motherland when they should be over there on the side of inquiry. For instance, there was too much patriotism and too little investigation when our race to the moon got underway. Faced with a story full of complex technology, many newsmen relied on press handouts from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. As long as the countdown to the moon went smoothly, all was well. Then a flash fire in an Apollo test capsule. 3 astronauts burned to death on January 27, 1967. The news media belatedly, terribly belatedly, discovered that NASA had no rescue plans for such an emergency, and that a report criticizing the workmanship in building the Apollo capsule had been made more than a year before. There have been other sacred cows, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Peace Corps, to name 2 federal agencies which long enjoyed very benign reporting. A current example to be watched to see whether news stories about it are tough-minded instead of simpering is the Environmental Protection Agency. Parochial pride often has been at work on the news too. Coverage of civic projects, for example. Down through the years of proliferating freeways and multiplying skyscrapers, some of the best news enterprises reported such projects with hurrahs instead of skeptical investigation. More recently, the great stadium binge has shown that news boosterism still is alive and doing well. That has no particular local reference, unless you want to make something of it. When I made a count as we were writing our book, I found at least 20 new sports stadiums had recently been built or were on their way in this country's major metropolitan areas. More have appeared since then. This outlay of money, mostly in public bond issues, has been enormous when cities are beset with needs for mass transit, pollution controls, better housing, and when all but a few of the building cities already had some type of sports stadium. If undue respect and allegiance sometimes helps to explain why news stories aren't covered, plain nearsightedness explains some others. It's not as romantic as conspiracy, but I think it's there just the same. Each generation behaves pretty much as if it is frozen the river of time. Generals fight the last war. Politicians take the previous campaign as their textbook. The average householder will figure the budget from yesterday afternoon's prices. The changes which tomorrow is going to bring catch us by surprise. Some of this afflicts news enterprises too. Habits are hard to get out of even when they're sadly outdated. We've seen plenty of these bad habits, outdated habits, in fairly recent times in the news. Long after the era of mobility and increased leisure had arrived, newspapers, by and large, hadn't gone beyond the type of travel story which could be found in a Chamber of Commerce brochure. Radio and television seldom did even that much. Until very recently, news about women, in whatever medium, has been more confection than content. The issues of birth control, women's rights, genuine shopper's information, only recently have thrust through between the bride's photos and the garden club notes. And even now, in an era when virtually everyone below the very rich despairs of finding and financing decent housing, a decent place to live, the real estate sections of many newspapers still are public relations puffery. They praise suburban sprawl and wafer-walled apartments. Well, luckily, news people are educable, or we still would be reading and hearing about marathon dancing and dirigibles. Many American news enterprises now cover environmental topics continually and with expertise. This change, which has happened just in the past few years primarily, struck me very hard in London. We found that in that most gracious and most salvageable of cities, environmental reporting has been badly neglected, and the developers and the bulldozers come on and come on. Another heartening trend in this country, some respectable consumer reporting has been appearing in news media. Guessing ahead is risky, but some other trends may be on the way. I have a small hunch that in time the news media may have gerontology reporters to write about the culture and doings of the elderly, just as youth reporters in recent years have started to cover the youth scene. If the work week keeps shrinking, there may be leisure reporters reporting on how people manage to fill their time. Perhaps it's fantasy to suggest there will be technology reporters in the general news media who might specialize, say, in covering what computers are doing. Now, I, for one, certainly could use such reporters. Perhaps that's fantasy, there'll be such people, but perhaps not. And it should be said, at least briefly, in closing on this section, that some stories aren't reported fully because of barriers in the way of reporting. Barriers put up by news sources, not by the news media. The mania for secrecy in the federal government has been well known, with the mountains of classified documents amassed by bureaucrats and politicians. We tend to forget that other levels of government and business and labor have their own roadblocks for reporters. The closed committee meeting long has been treasured by city councilmen and school board members. Corporations and labor unions have been known to ban reporters for doing their job too diligently. Recently, some protest groups have refused to permit coverage by reporters of a different race or culture or sex. Well, none of these barriers to reporting are the fault of the news media, remember, but still, they go on the list of lost news.
If some stories don't get told at all because of lack of access or withholding of information, others are told incompletely. The story is there on the air or in your newspaper or magazine, but part of it is missing. Without a crystal ball, can you tell anything about what isn't there? Sometimes. Sometimes it's easier than you think. First of all, does the news come to you with perspective? You don't have to have the whole history of automobile safety recited every time there's a car wreck, goodness knows. But if war breaks out in Upper Volta, most of us are going to need some background included. It's not enough to know that 125 troops were reported to have died today in a battle on Upper Volta's northern border. We need such background information as what tensions caused the battle, what factions are involved, have there been other outbreaks, are other countries involved? Any news consumer can compile his own list of missing backdrops for the news. Here are a few which have occurred to us in the course of watching coverage over the past few years. Stories we saw about draft resistance during the high tide of protest against the Vietnam War seldom included the perspective that such resistance was nothing new in the American tradition. Countless U.S. families are descended from immigrants who came to this country to escape military conscription in their European homelands. And even here, there were enormous riots against the draft during the Civil War. While in World War I, more than 20,000 men reported to military camps as conscientious objectors, and another 337,000 were on the War Department records as draft evaders. Communes have been reported as a recent phenomenon, although they are a long theme in U.S. history. At least 170 communes existed in this country between 1663 and 1900. One assumption behind much reporting about government policies at home and abroad is that the U.S. is a young country, still a bold newcomer to the world scene. But ours is one of the world's oldest nations in terms of type of government. The Soviet Union, France, the People's Republic of China, the United States by now has an older form of government than these nations and most others. Another kind of perspective often missing from news stories is the view from another country. Plainly enough, different cultures have different ways of looking at events. That's been strikingly evident on this continent ever since the Aztecs, who fought to take prisoners, encountered the Spanish, who fought to kill. As many national disparities of viewpoint exist as there are boundaries between countries, and the news consumer can't hope to keep up with many of these conflicting perspectives, but he can turn to some sources for a sample of views from other lands. Here are just two examples. Atlas Magazine is a monthly entirely devoted to reprint articles from other countries, where the views focus on very different worlds than we're used to. Then on weekly television, there's World Press, a program put out by Public Broadcasting Service that reviews newspaper coverage in several parts of the world. It's useful for the American consumer to realize that in a week when a congressional debate is dominating the news here, the Indian press is focusing on a visit by an official from the Politburo. What else may be missing besides perspective? Well, journalists sometimes talk about holes that they find in stories, obvious questions that aren't answered, important information that just isn't there. Take an example. The U.S. Bureau of the Census counted 791,839 American Indians in 1970, a jump of more than 50% from the 1960 total. Well, what do we have here? Some incredible explosion in the birth rate? No, said the Census Bureau. The reasons for the precipitous increase, which compared to a rise of only 13% in the total population, were different classification procedures and increased pride among Indians. Well, the simple but tricky explanation then is that in 1970, more people were calling themselves Indians. That story demanded an answer to the question why, and the Associated Press reporter provided it. All right then, you've gone hunting for proper perspective and you've filled in or at least spotted the obvious holes. A final point to look for is opposition viewpoints. While I was working as a reporter for a New Jersey daily, the president of the State Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, believe it or not, his name was Vigilante, gave a speech in which he said, the PBA is in favor of capital punishment and believes that without it there would be a 100% increase in the crime rate. Criminals are not eager to die for their crimes, but they would not hesitate to take part in more vicious acts if it were not for the threat of capital punishment. The news story carried in my paper gave a straight report of Mr. Vigilante's remarks, and it provided a good example of the old school of reporting, which rates a story as adequate as long as the words of the speaker are accurately reproduced. It's also an example of what's wrong with that kind of news. Not until several days later did the information get corrected, and then it came in a letter to the editor. The executive secretary of the Council to Abolish Capital Punishment retorted, I challenge Mr. Vigilante to offer even one bit of evidence to support his claims. All the evidence collected in this country for the last 50 years shows that long terms of imprisonment are as effective deterrents as the death penalty, And nowhere in the world where capital punishment has been abolished has the crime rate risen because criminals were no longer executed. Well, that's right. The reporter could have found it out by consulting his nearest encyclopedia. What he should have done was to call someone when he got back to the newsroom and ask for a balancing comment, and then put that in the news story. As it was printed, it reads as a serious comment on the value of capital punishment rather than what it really was, a reflection of the state of mind of the president of the state PBA. A story that you may have seen earlier this month provides an interesting counterpoint here. New York State has just activated a law which provides extremely stiff punishment for drug pushers, and I gather that almost anyone in possession of a drug is defined as a pusher. Now, you might expect that the police would applaud this stiffer law, but they haven't. They don't like it at all, as an excellent NBC network news clip revealed. Why? Because a person about to be apprehended under terms of this new law faces as great a possible jail sentence as does a cop killer. The police who were interviewed believe with genuine alarm that a lot more people are going to start shooting rather than give up to a certain life sentence.
Remember the great Santa Barbara oil spill? It was back on the network news just last night. Controversy starting to brew out there again about renewed offshore drilling. Early in 1969, an offshore drilling platform blew out. An estimated 4 million gallons of oil contaminated 40 miles of coastline near Santa Barbara, California. Well, promptly, the Senate Subcommittee on Air and Water Pollution summoned Fred Hartley, the president of Union Oil. The next day, the New York Times story had that remarkable quote from Hartley: "I'm amazed at the publicity for the loss of a few birds caught in the oil slick, and this 40-mile smearing of the coastline." Well, that quote did it. A new casualty plopped down among the deceased wildfowl. Oilman Hartley was a dead duck. After the Times ran his quote, so did the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post in an editorial, and Time Magazine, and David Brinkley on the NBC Evening News, and then the New York Times ran it again in its Sunday week in the Review. "Lord, I wish he hadn't said that," another Union Oil official mourned. Well, he hadn't. What happened was that the New York Times reporter was called out of the subcommittee hearing. When he returned, the Christian Science Monitor reporter filled him in on what had happened. In the noise of the hearing room, the Times man mistook the quick paraphrase for a direct quote. As later released in the official transcript of the hearings, Hartley's statement read, "I think we have to look at these problems relatively. I am always tremendously impressed at the publicity that death of birds receives versus the loss of people in our country." Well, it's still not enough to gladden the hearts of ecologists very much, but it's not as cold-blooded as the original quote. And Hartley made the comment while explaining his company's efforts to clean up what he himself called the desecration of the California coastline. How does one reporter's miscue show up in several different newspapers, especially several of the most scrupulous news enterprises in the country? The managing editor of the Wall Street Journal explained, "We picked up the quote from the Times. It's embarrassing, and it violated our rule that we never take anything from a secondary source." What is the news consumer to do in such a case of misinformation, and repeated misinformation in this case? Simply be diligent by keeping an eye out for more information after the initial story. News does not stop with the first story. It may show up later in a variety of forms, in follow-up news reports, in explanatory or challenging stories, in letters to the editor, in corrections and apologies. This time, in the case of the Hartley quote, all the newspapers printed the correction of Hartley's quote when told of it, and all the airing news outlets apologized. Newsweek, which had not run the erroneous quote, very happily ran a story about all the news enterprises who had. It's an old cliche that the error is front page news, but the correction appears in a tiny scrap of type back on page 38. I think this is much less true than it used to be. A paper such as the Louisville Courier-Journal, for instance, runs corrections in a regular feature called Beg Your Pardon. A number of other newspapers regularly correct themselves in similar fashion, and all of them should. While the ethics of apology and correction may be getting better, there still are cases which test the news consumer's diligence. This, for instance, is the table of contents page of an issue of Harper's in July 1970. Now, somewhere on this page is an admission of very serious and grievous error. It is right here in about the smallest print ever seen by human eye. And it's caught only by someone who scans every single bit of this page. It reads, "Erratum. We are advised that there were a number of factual inaccuracies in an article about the New York Post by Jack Newfield in our September issue." That was 10 months earlier, incidentally. "We regret any harm that may have been done as a result of its publication. The editors." Well, luckily, you don't have to be quite as keen-eyed in every case to find corrections and apologies. One source of correction and comment the news consumer can count on, and usually in standard-sized type, is the section of letters to the editor. You ought to read them avidly. I confess to being a letters to the editor hobbyist. Reading them, that is, not writing them. I could never challenge the record of the late Charles Hooper of Idaho, who reportedly wrote thousands of letters to the editor and had them published. Hooper always was indignant that people assumed he was retired, with nothing better to do than write letters all day long. "I am not retired," he huffed to one interviewer, "but very active in my chosen profession, that of a newspaper letter writer." Well, one of the delights for a visitor to Britain also is the letters column of the Times of London, certainly one of the repositories of wit and wisdom in Western culture. When Carol and I were there earlier this year and reading the Times every morning, the Times letters revealed everything from the proper way to grasp a bishop's staff to the most popular names among all the babies whose birth had been reported in the Times during the year. That's a regular feature from a regular letter writer early in January each year. But letters to the editor are serious as well as whimsical, and they provide an important corrective in the news process. Even without self-admissions from news outlets, the news consumer is not entirely defenseless in judging the quality of news. Quite a number of tools can be found. Perhaps, besides the ideas we've tried to provide for you to keep in mind about the news process and suggestions about how to look carefully at the news, there are hard-working critics of the media you can turn to. Perhaps the most useful is the Columbia Journalism Review, a very lively magazine put out by the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University 6 times a year. This is not the current issue, the issue before last, Watergate issue. Around the country, news people in several cities have started publications themselves to keep an eye on their local media. You can find addresses for such local media reviews in the back issues of the Columbia Journalism Review, in the magazine's front section called Passing Comment. In fact, the current September-October issue has a list of local journalism reviews in it. On page 40, there are none in this area. There are in cities such as Chicago, Fairbanks, Dallas, Houston, New York, Portland, Philadelphia, Review of Southern Californian Journalism. That's about half of the list. These reviews have waxed and waned, but their number throughout the country seems to stay fairly constant. On public television, there has been the media monitoring show called Behind the Lines. On radio, there's the weekly Sunday morning feature called CBS Views the Press. Magazines have been full of articles about the news media the past few years. The record I can remember, and this was before Watergate, was 7 such articles in big general magazines on the newsstand all at the same time. Or if you'd rather do it yourself on a story such as Watergate, you can check on media coverage by sitting down and watching the hearings yourself. The testimony of White House staffer Richard Moore, for instance, had to be seen and heard to be appreciated. The printed page could not fully convey the difference between Moore's calm, avuncular attitude while reading his prepared statement and his confusion under Terry Lenzner's very tough questioning. The complaint is that all this Watergate watching takes so much time. Funny, it doesn't seem too startling that citizenship should take some time and effort. I suggest a national accounting at the end of this year. Anybody who has spent more time looking at Watergate hearings than at soap operas or televised sports wins the right to gripe about all the time it took. On a day-by-day basis, Carol sometimes does in her journalism classes what anybody with a tape recorder can do: record the first several stories on each of 2 network evening news shows and compare the coverage. Perhaps before too long, you can add sight to sound in such comparison, as home videotape recorders are being developed. You can look, too, for media courses at a college or university. Maybe I have a captive audience to some extent in that respect tonight. Those that deal with the news process from a news consumer's point of view are just now beginning to appear here and there across the country.
I get just a few brief paragraphs to wind up this formal part. Perhaps most importantly, go home and consider an overhaul of your reading and viewing habits. Nationwide surveys in recent years have indicated that a majority of people use television as their major or only news source. But as Walter Cronkite has pointed out, a half-an-hour network news program contains less wordage than the front page of an edition of the New York Times. It's impossible to be well informed from such a scanty source of news. The principle of diversity works. The more you can read and listen, the better chance you have of coming up with an accurate assessment of events. In a place such as Ames, you should have considerable chance to do so. Wander into the library an hour or so a week, for example, and look over the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. Another week, try the National Observer, the Miami Herald, the Atlanta Constitution, or any of a number of other diligent newspapers around the country. On the home front, criticize your local news organizations when they deserve it. Let them know you're watching and that you're well informed. More than likely, they'll listen. At most places we've worked or know anything about, a few well-researched letters on the same theme can indeed make news executives sit up and take notice. And every now and then, reinforce the news people for something you think they did well. That's rare news indeed for them.